Today we are going to discuss a poem from your DSC paper. It is a poem written by Jibanananda Das. The name of the poem is I Shall Return to This Bengal. So let me share the screen at first. Hope you can see the screen. Is it? So this poem, I think most of you are familiar with this text. It is a Bengali poem which is translated into English, and this poem is part of your partition literature paper. So we need to read this poem against the backdrop of partition at the same time. So let's begin. That we can say that this poem, I Shall Return to This Bengal, is a quintessential depiction of the beauty of Bengal. It is taken from the anthology which is called Ruposhi Bangla. This anthology was published posthumously, that means after the death of the poet, in 1954. But the poems of this collection, Ruposhi Bangla, were written much earlier, as said by the critics. In the 1930s, they were written, and this poem was probably composed in 1934. And the poet wanted to publish those group of poems related to Bengal under the name Banglar Trosto Nilima. That was the initial title. But remember that it did not succeed, and ultimately after his death, all the poems were published under the name Ruposhi Bangla. So if you look at the nature, the kind of typical features of the poetry of Jibanananda Das, his attitude to nature, his kind of romantic attitude, we can find some kind of instances of that. Remember that when the poet was writing, the kind of greatest poet was no other than Tagore. Tagore was in his 70s. In 1934, Tagore was 73 years old. And it is very difficult for any other poet who has come after the Tagore era or the post-Tagore era or the late Tagore era, and who had tried to write something new, because most of them have used the kind of typical images of Tagore. So Tagore is a kind of towering presence after the late Tagore period or post-Tagore era. But here, this poet is an exception, because Jibanananda Das, he did not follow Tagore slavishly. In his case, we can find a typical blending of the tradition and the individual talent, as said by T.S. Eliot. He used some of the materials from the kind of Tagore's aesthetics, but also used some original images. He is one of the most original voices in the canon of Bengali literature. Just wait, let me add someone. I think you can see the screen again. So as he was saying that his case is a kind of example of the tradition and the individual talent. Eliot said that no one can be a great poet without knowing tradition. You must have tradition in your bones. So he knew that whatever has been written or created till now, but he refused to follow the beaten track. He introduced some original images, unconventional images, to paint the beauty of Bengal. Remember that I already told you that Jibanananda or Buddhadev Bosu, Vishnudev, Shamur Sen, they were basically professors of English, but they continued to enrich the field of Bengali literature, enrich the canon of Bengali literature. This is their gift to their native tongue, native language. Let me add someone, just wait. Okay. And his first collection of poetry is known as Jhara Paluk, or in English you can call it Fallen Feathers. The first collection that came out in 1927. And with the publication of this Fallen Feathers, one can find the presence of a original voice, the poetic idiom that he chose to create makes him a different poet from others. He hitchhiked the Bengali wagon saturated with the Tagorean aesthetics and took it into an exotic world of differently shaping imagination. He is romantic, no doubt. But as a romantic poet, he foregrounds, he initiates a different type of idiom. His version of romanticism is devoted to or engaged in articulating a different poetic idiom. That's why the conventional, the stereotypical, the hackneyed romantic signifiers are consciously rejected by the poet. Giving you one example, the much exploited image of rain is rejected in favor of the image of dew. One example. And you can say that he liberates the Bengali poetry from any kind of overtly conscious romanticism. He doesn't philosophize upon the spectacle of life. He doesn't use the medium of poetry to preach his philosophical sermons. He doesn't don the mantle of a preacher. Remember the age in which he lived, 1930s. The time was not fit enough for that kind of absolute romanticism, where like an Wordsworth or like a kind of Shelley, you are devoted to nature, the beauteous aspects of nature. So he realized the confused social milieu. He was aware of that. So his romanticism is more leaning towards realism. His romanticism is not too much glamour. not about too much glamour, because in his attitude to nature we find the celebration of the unostentatious, the ordinary, the mundane aspect of nature, not something that is heroic, not something that is almost heavenly, transcendental, celestial, as one can find in, for example, Tintin Abbey. And his poems of Jhara Paluk bear testimony to this aspect of the poet. And then, if we focus our attention on the poems of Ruposhi Bangla, we find that the poet is poeticizing or eulogizing the archetypical rural Bengal. He was born in rural Borisha, that you know. This district was famous for its natural plenitude. This district was famous for a kind of cornucopia of natural beauty. So it creates a kind of narrative context from which his poems originate. The flora and the fauna of Bengal is celebrated in his poems that inscribes his visionary aesthetics. Now let us look at the beginning of this text. All of you are familiar with these lines, immortal lines from a genius. I shall return to this Bengal, to the Dhanshiri's bank, perhaps not as a man, but moina or fishing kite or dawn crow, floating on the mist's bosom to alight in the shade of this jackfruit tree in this autumn harvest land. So, in the first 4 lines of this poem, the poet says that he wants to return desperately again and again to this Bengal in next life, in the form of birds, if not in the form of human beings. What does he say? I shall return to this Bengal. So this desperate urge to return to his native landscape is felt by the side of the river Dhanshiri, but not as a man, but look at what he wants to be in next life. He might return as moina or fishing kite, shalik, or dawn crow, bhorer kaak, floating on the mist's bosom to alight in the shade of this jackfruit tree in this autumn harvest land. So, before going into the depth of these lines, you need to know something about the context of the 1930s. You know that Bengal is the only province that had witnessed the trauma of partition twice under the colonial rule. One in 1905 and the second is 1947. So this poem was composed before 1947, and if you read some critical works, for example, Devjani Sengupta writes that the literature of Bangladesh has shown extreme political awareness, and critics unhesitatingly consider these 2 events as crucial to the development of Bangladesh's literature. And she gives us some examples like Ritik Ghatak, like Kaji Abdul Wadud or Jibanananda. For them, the Bengal is a landscape of the mind, and it was imprinted in the collective memory of Bengalis. So, the 1905 partition, obviously the poet was a child at the time, but the effect of that can be found to some extent in his poetry. So the nefarious plan that was hatched by Lord Curzon was a bane to Bengal. What was the actual agenda of that partition? The actual agenda was not the administrative ease, but it was an evil plan to divide the Bengalis, to nullify the nascent Bengali nationalism. And from 1905 to 1947, you can find that Bengal had witnessed sporadic outbursts of communal riots, especially in Rajshahi, Kumilla, Jamalpur, Calcutta. So, the kind of rise of such communal riots that create a kind of, that give birth to a fissiparous identity, the separatist ideology, the ideal notion of Bengal, the concept of oneness was being destroyed under the threat of such nefarious ideology. So when you situate this poem against the context of partition, this poem multiplies its meaning, proliferates its meaning. It assumes the wider significance. And when you look at this poem against the backdrop of partition, it doesn't become only a naive aesthetic work of art, but a strong poetic affirmation, a kind of bold statement about the unity of Bengal, about the consecrated ethos of the traditional values of Bengal, an enunciation of the sovereignty of Bengal, which is timeless and which is ahistorical. It is not limited or constricted by the spatio-temporal boundaries. That's why he says desperately that I shall return to this Bengal. So which Bengal does he want to return? He is just talking about the different forms that he would like to take up. Name of different birds are there. Moyna, dawn crow, or some other birds you can find out in the next few lines. But what is that timeless, ahistorical depiction of Bengal? For that you need to read another poem, a kind of companion piece, that is I Have Seen Bengal's Face, which is known in Bengali as Banglar Mukh Ami Dekhiachi. So this is the ahistorical space, the archetypical version of Bengal, where he wants to return. So right from the beginning, one finds the desperate urge to return. The desire for return is underscored in the opening lines. He is a visionary poet. He is prescient enough to understand the impending doom. He is willing to to actually forego his human sensibility and accept the non-human form of consciousness. You can think of Ted Hughes. One can remind oneself of the poems of Hughes, who would foreground the non-human subjectivity later in his animal poems, the kind of shamanic influences, the presence of the elan vital in the world of nature. What Hughes actually used to believe, that human beings cannot connect to those kind of shamanic influences that are there, but a bird can establish the link with that energy which human beings are unaware of. This is what he believed. Perhaps if you look at this poem from the post-humanist point of view, one can find much more meanings into these lines. His ability, or his actually urge to forego the human consciousness, and his urge for adopting, imbibing the non-human forms of consciousness, can be understood as the desire to be an organic part of nature. As a human being, he cannot mix organically with the elements of nature. That can be the other interpretation of these lines. So, we can see that the entire poem bespeaks, reveals the poet's irresistible love for Bengal. The sight of Bengal's beauty holds irresistible charm for him. He cannot but respond to the matchless beauty of Bengal. You might call it a topographical poem, but it is not a topographical poem in the sense some neoclassical writers have composed the topographical poems, sans imagination, sans profundity of love. It is a kind of celebration of the unsullied, the unadulterated ideal of Bengal with its cornucopia of natural beauty. The way the poet presents before us the ideal of Bengal is really striking. For example, you can find the presence of some birds, the mention of some birds in this poem. And if you look at the canon of romantic literature, you can find that there are lots of bird poems in this canon, isn't it? You can think of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, Shelley's Skylar. So all such bird poems celebrate the imagination. Birds have wings, they can fly. So obviously the bird image is a kind of common image for the free play of imagination. But here, that aspect can be there, that he wants to fly away from the kind of the problems. He wants to have freedom from the bondage. It can be, you cannot rule out this possibility. But one thing you also need to look at, that the choice of birds in this poem are lowly birds, are unattractive birds, isn't it? They are not glamorous, like the fishing kite, like crow, like owl. Even they are attractive to the poet. Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, and he is a poet of totality. That's why even the mundane, the unglamorous arrests his imagination. You can think that nature is anything but nature in the poetry of William Wordsworth. Nature is his spiritual anchor, a nurse, guide. But here, in the poetry of Jibanananda, nature is nature in the true sense of the term. He doesn't spiritualize in that way. That's why he is more Keatsian in approach. The poetry of the earth is never dead. So this choice of such unattractive birds might underscore the fact that you might go for the mega things of life, but do not overlook the mundane. Do not overlook what is there in front of you. As Lear said, now little things will please us, Cordelia. We two alone will sing like birds in the cage. So we shall live and pray and sing and tell old tales and laugh at gilded butterflies. This is life at the simple level. The old Lear realizes at the end of the tragedy about the simplicity of life. The egocentric Lear dies and a new Lear comes out afresh at the end of the text. This realization of the tragic hero one can remember. But for the poet, it is natural, spontaneous reaction. Okay. And in this context, you need to look at what a famous critic, Buddhadev Bosu, has written here. Just do it. Yes. So Buddhadev Bosu, in his book An Acre of Green Grass, has rightly said of the poet that a nature worshipper, but by no means a Platonist or pantheist. He is rather a pagan who loves the things of nature sensuously, not as tokens or symbols, nor as patterns of perfection, but simply because they are what they are. So, kind of wonderful summation of Jibanananda's aesthetics as a nature worshipper. So, to come back to these lines, these mundane birds, fishing kites, dawn crow, are more closer to nature, isn't it? So he wants to fly like a dawn crow and float on the mist's bosom. It is a figure of speech. Do you know what it is? Mist's bosom is a metaphor. So, taking the form of a dawn crow, ভোরের কাক হয়ে, he wants to come back. He wants to alight under the shade of this jackfruit tree. He wants to alight in the shade of this tree in this autumn harvest land. Remember that in the poetic world of Jibanananda, two favorite seasons of the Bengali poets, one is spring and the other is winter, are significantly absent. He writes about Hemonto or late autumn, It is a season of mist and fog. The approach is Keatsian. You need not go for the mega things of life. So the much celebrated seasons of Bengal are not given much space in his poetry. On the other hand, he talks about this late autumn and celebrates its beauty, not from a pessimistic angle. You can think of Macbeth. My way of life is fallen into the seer, the yellow leaf. So Macbeth's despondency was brought out by Shakespeare through that autumnal imagery. But here, the poet doesn't use the autumn imagery in that manner. And one can also remember of W.B.Yeats's poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, where we find that the poet wants to go away from the din and bustle of the city and to that idyllic world of Innisfree. But there is a difference. Unlike Yeats, the poet doesn't use the kind of escapist tone. Okay, so one is actually attracted by his acute power of observation. Look at the next few lines. Or maybe a duck a young girl's builds on my red feet, drifting on the cold-scented waters all the day. For love of Bengal's rivers, fields, crops, I shall come this way to this green shore of Bengal, drenched by Jolongi's waves. So he wants to be a duck. A young girl's bells on my red feet, but still closer to nature. So this Bengal, which is a kind of landscape of the mind for him, which is undivided, which is not separated by any type of Fissiparous ideology, and wants to drift on the cold-scented waters. So this is a kind of image of sensuousness. For love of Bengal's rivers, fields, crops. So all these sides of Bengal hold a kind of irresistible charm for him. He cannot separate himself in next life or the upcoming lives. He believes in reincarnation, but obviously he doesn't want to go anywhere apart from this landscape. Remember that this is not a kind of romanticized depiction of the nature, cut off from, delinked from the real world. Reality blended with, tempered by these kinds of romanticism. They are operating side by side. They are not blind to the kind of real sight. It is not that he is forgetful about the kind of contemporary social milieu and is writing from an ivory tower. So he wants to come this way to this green shore of Bengal, drenched by Jolongi's waves. So all the aspects of nature, the parks, the rivers, the birds, they are given a kind of space in his poetry. They are consecrated, isn't it? Look at the next few lines. Perhaps you will see a glass fly ride the evening breeze, or hear a barn owl call from the silk cotton tree, a little child toss rice grains on the courtyard grass. Look at the choice of images. Look at the mention of the birds, insects. You will see a glass fly riding the evening breeze. You might hear a barn owl, Lokki Pecha, hooting from the silk cotton tree, from the Shimulgach, silk cotton tree. One can obviously remember the last stanza of Keats's To Autumn, the way he has celebrated the songs of the insects, isn't it? So, the humming of the bees, for example, as said by the Keats, or such kinds of presence of the grasshoppers, they actually create a kind of image of nature, a world of nature of its own, that may not be as attractive as the season of spring with the presence of a nightingale. But you need not complain for that. You have your own beauty too. So, or hear a barn owl call from the silk cotton tree. The third image, it is like a cinematic kind of image, one image after another flashing before our eyes. A little child tossing rice grains on the courtyard grass. So, a kind of frolicsome activity, maybe a reference to the Navannu, a little child who is tossing rice grains. In some translations, rice grain is written as puffed rice. So, the little child tossing rice grains on the courtyard grass. This is the kind of homely images, the familiar images that one can find if one step into the Bengal. And you cannot draw lines. Lines are shadow. The lines, the borders are meaningless. And all the texts of this partition literature paper reaffirm this concept again and again, that the kind of border lines are actually the shadow lines. You cannot separate the human beings whose culture is similar, who inhabit a kind of landscape where they share a kind of communality with others. Got it? And the last three lines, or a boy on Ruksha's turgid stream steer a dinghy with torn white sail. Again a kind of familiar image. A boy on the turgid, that means not clear, Gholajal of Ruksha, and steering a dinghy with torn white sail. The last image is the image of the white egrets, Saroshbok, swimming through red clouds to their home in the dark. The last image is surrealistic at the same time. Egrets swimming through red clouds to their home in the dark. So these are the natural images. These are the mundane birds. So if anyone tries to find the poet, he has to look at this aspect. He will have to look at these sights. You will find me among their crowd. Among these mundane birds, among these beauteous aspects of Bengal, one can find the poet. So, as I told you that it is not that type of romantic poet, but romanticism is being guided by a totality of vision. So in this context, you need to read this poem. You need to understand the kind of majesty of the poet, the way he has celebrated the unsullied ideal of Bengal, the matchless beauty of Bengal, and that is why he cannot but respond to it. He is romantic, at the same time he is realistic. So bird imagery is there. For example, you need to think about that bird image that signifies freedom, many other things, but not the traditional, the usual commonplaces are kind of used by the poet. The technique is very much cinematic. Got it? So, and this poem also assumes much significance when you read it against the partition of Bengal. Remember that this poem has got a potentiality that it is not limited by any particular time and space or chronotype. That's why this poem was very popular during the মুক্তি যুদ্ধ। সেই সময় কিন্তু এই পোয়েমটা কিন্তু অনেক বেশি পপুলার হয়ে ওঠে। Even nowadays you can again find that this poem is again gaining its popularity against this social milieu. So it is not a dated poem. Though it was written before 1947, after 1947 or 1971 war, or even in today's context, one can contextualize this poem and you will often feel that this is the voice, this is the kind of message of the present time, that you need not raise walls between people. So this humanistic approach is something that you need to look at this poem.